Tonight, let the noise of the present grow quiet. There is nothing here you need to memorize, nothing you need to solve. This is a story to follow gently, and if sleep comes, the story can continue without you. It is the story of how rival colonial worlds became one American experiment. Part 1. America was not one people.
If you landed in America in the early 1700s, you would not find one people becoming one nation. You would find rival cultures, rival faiths, rival ruling classes, and rival ideas of freedom. Some came to build a holy commonwealth. Some came to build a landed aristocracy. Some came for tolerance, trade, independence, or the right to be left alone. That means America did not begin as a united country. It began as a contest between civilizations planted on the same continent. And that matters because many of the arguments we think of as modern were here from the beginning. Order versus liberty, hierarchy versus equality, local control versus moral mission. To understand why America has always argued with itself, we have to go back to the first settlers and the rival worlds they brought with them. Because the Constitution did not create one culture. It created a way for competing cultures to live together. The first great stream came to New England. These were the Puritans, and they did not cross the ocean mainly to find freedom as modern Americans use the word. They came to build a godly society. The Puritan vision prized order, discipline, education, moral seriousness, and communal purpose. They believed liberty meant living rightly under God, not simply doing as you pleased. This culture built towns, schools, churches, and institutions with remarkable energy. It valued self-rule, but not radical individualism. Its freedom was bounded by duty. That inheritance still matters. The New England impulse has long pushed America toward reform, moral crusades, and the belief that society can and should be improved by disciplined leadership. Farther south, a very different society took root in Virginia. The Cavaliers and the great planters did not build tight religious communities. They built a world of rank, land, influence, and personal rule. This was a hierarchical culture. It admired gentlemen, deference, family lineage, and the idea that society naturally sorted itself into higher and lower stations. Its idea of liberty was not the same as the Puritans. For the Cavaliers, liberty often meant the rights of the powerful to govern themselves without interference from above. So even at the beginning, two American definitions of freedom were already colliding. One said liberty depends on moral order. The other said liberty belongs most fully to those with the standing to exercise it. Then came the Quakers in the mid-Atlantic, especially Pennsylvania. Their political instinct was different again. They distrusted coercion and emphasized conscience, tolerance, and peaceful coexistence. This region became one of the most pluralistic places in colonial America. Different faiths, different peoples, and different ways of life learned to operate side by side. The Quaker inheritance pushed America toward liberty of conscience, negotiation, and the idea that social peace does not require total cultural agreement. That was a radically important contribution. In New York, another pattern emerged through Dutch commercial influence. This world was shaped less by moral mission or landed aristocracy, and more by trade, profit, and practical coexistence. The merchant culture prized enterprise, bargaining, and a certain realism about human motives. People did not have to like one another to do business with one another. That commercial spirit became one of the most durable parts of America. It taught that prosperity can stabilize diversity, and that a society may hold together through exchange even when deeper loyalties remain divided. Then there was the backcountry. Settled heavily by Scots-Irish and other borderland peoples, it produced yet another American character. This one was hard, suspicious, fiercely independent, and quick to resist outside control. These settlers had little patience for distant elites telling them how to live. Their liberty was personal, local, and martial. They trusted kin, not institutions. This culture carried a powerful sense of honor and self-defense. It also carried deep suspicion of centralized authority, refined manners, and imposed moral supervision from elsewhere. Now step back and look at the whole picture. New England was not Virginia. Pennsylvania was not the backcountry. New York was not a Puritan commonwealth. These were not minor regional accents inside one shared civilization. They were rival social orders with different beliefs about power, virtue, class, religion, violence, and freedom itself. That is why early America was never truly united in the simple way we sometimes imagine. The colonies often cooperated when threatened, but they did not agree on what a good society should be. And this helps explain the first culture wars in America. They were not just arguments about taxes or distant kings. They were clashes between different inherited visions of how life ought to be lived. Should society be morally unified or broadly tolerant? Should elites lead or common people resist? Should authority flow from ordered institutions or from local self-assertion? Those are old questions. In many ways, they are America's original questions. But if these cultures were so different, why did they eventually join together at all? The answer is not that they suddenly became one people. The answer is that they faced a common imperial crisis. The conflict with Britain forced these rival regions into shared resistance. But even then, they did not all resist for the same reasons. Some feared distant tyranny. Some feared economic restraint. Some feared moral corruption. Some simply refused to be ruled by outsiders. The revolution created a military alliance. It did not erase cultural difference. If anything, independence made the problem more obvious. What kind of country was this going to be? A moral republic? A commercial federation? A planter-led order? A loose confederation of self-governing peoples? That was the real challenge after independence. Not just how to break from Britain, but how to keep rival American cultures from breaking apart from each other. This is where the Constitution enters the story in a new light. We often talk about it as if it simply created a nation from scratch. But in another sense, it did something more delicate and more brilliant. It became a framework for coexistence among regional civilizations that did not fully trust one another. A structure of compromise, a system of negotiated power. Federalism gave room for local variation. Checks and balances slowed domination. Representation gave different interests a stake in the system. In that sense, the Constitution was not merely a blueprint for liberty. It was a peace treaty between cultures. That does not mean the peace was perfect. Far from it. Some of the deepest contradictions in American life were left unresolved, especially slavery and the competing moral visions surrounding it. The American settlement could manage difference for a time, but it could not permanently suppress every conflict between rival systems of life. Still, the constitutional order mattered because it created a way for profound disagreement to exist inside one republic without immediate collapse. That is no small achievement. And the deeper lesson is this. America has always contained multiple definitions of freedom. Freedom as ordered virtue. Freedom as local self-rule. Freedom as tolerance. Freedom as independence from elites. Freedom as commercial opportunity. These traditions have spent centuries competing, blending, restraining, and provoking one another. That is not a sign that America failed to become a nation. It is part of what America is. The tension was there at the start, and in many ways it still defines us now. So when people talk about returning to the original America, it is worth asking a hard question. Which original America do they mean? The disciplined New England town, the hierarchical Virginia estate, the tolerant mid-Atlantic port, the defiant frontier settlement. There was no single founding culture waiting at the beginning. There were several, and they did not agree about the meaning of liberty, authority, or the good life. That may sound like weakness, but it may also be one of America's strange strengths, because a people formed from rivals had to learn the arts of bargaining, restraint, and constitutional coexistence. Unity in America was never going to come from sameness. It had to come from a shared structure strong enough to contain difference without crushing it. That is a more fragile vision of nationhood, but it may also be a more honest one. And that leaves us with a question that still matters. Can rival visions of freedom coexist inside one republic without tearing it apart? Can a constitutional order hold when cultures no longer trust each other's idea of liberty? That was the challenge at the founding. It is still the challenge now. America did not begin as one culture. It began as an argument. And the durability of the American experiment may depend on whether we remember what the framers were really trying to do. Not create uniformity, but build peace among differences strong enough to survive freedom itself.
Before there was a nation, there were different worlds, each carrying its own habits of authority, order, faith, property, and freedom.
In 1630, a fleet of small English ships crossed the Atlantic carrying a bold experiment. Not an experiment in democracy, an experiment in building a moral society. These settlers believed freedom could only survive inside a disciplined community. Liberty to them did not mean doing whatever one wished. It meant living within a shared moral order. The leader of this expedition believed the colony would become a model for the world. Its success or failure would be watched closely. The stakes could not be higher. The man guiding this experiment was John Winthrop. His vision would shape the future of New England, and perhaps something even larger. Before reaching America, Winthrop delivered a message to the settlers. Their colony would stand as an example to the world. A city set upon a hill. Winthrop warned them that the world would be watching. If their society succeeded, it would inspire others. If it failed, it would bring humiliation. Soon, the ships reached the rugged coast of New England. Dense forests stretched beyond rocky shorelines. The Puritan experiment was about to begin. The settlers wasted little time. They began building towns organized around church, school, and local government. Each institution served the covenant community. At the center of every town stood the meeting house. It served both religious and civic purposes. Faith and governance lived side by side. For the Puritans, religion shaped nearly every part of life. Long sermons guided the community's understanding of morality. Faith was not private, it was public. Education also became central to the colony. The Puritans believed every person should be able to read scripture. Literacy spread rapidly throughout New England. Local government also developed quickly. Town meetings allowed citizens to discuss and vote on community matters. Responsibility and liberty grew together. These institutions helped the colony grow rapidly. More settlers arrived each year from England. New towns appeared across the wilderness. Yet Puritan leaders feared something deeply. They feared that moral disorder could destroy their fragile society. Without discipline, liberty would collapse. John Winthrop believed liberty came in two different forms. One kind strengthened communities, the other destroyed them. The first kind he called natural liberty. This meant the freedom to act without restraint. Winthrop believed it led to conflict and chaos. Natural liberty allowed people to follow their desires alone. But Winthrop believed human nature could not sustain peace without limits. Unrestrained freedom would destroy the community. The second kind he called civil liberty. This liberty existed within laws and shared moral boundaries. It required discipline and responsibility. Civil liberty, Winthrop argued, created true freedom. People flourished when society maintained moral order. Liberty and responsibility belonged together. For several years, the Puritan experiment appeared successful. Their towns grew stronger. Their institutions deepened. But a covenant society eventually faces a difficult question. What happens when someone challenges the shared beliefs of the community? One of the first challenges came from a minister named Roger Williams. Williams believed faith could not be forced by government authority. Williams argued that true belief must come freely from the individual conscience. Faith imposed by government, he warned, would corrupt religion itself. Puritan leaders feared this idea. If individuals followed their own beliefs, the covenant might collapse. In 1635, the colony banished Roger Williams. He fled through the winter wilderness seeking refuge. Williams eventually founded a new settlement. It became Rhode Island. Rhode Island offered something radical. People of different beliefs could live together freely. Soon, another challenge appeared inside Massachusetts itself. This time it came from Anne Hutchinson. Hutchinson believed individuals could experience God's grace directly. She questioned the authority of Puritan ministers. Her ideas spread rapidly across the colony. Soon the leadership felt the covenant itself was threatened. Hutchinson was brought to trial before colonial leaders. The outcome would shape the future of the colony. Like Roger Williams before her, Hutchinson was eventually banished. She and her followers left Massachusetts. These conflicts revealed the limits of Puritan liberty. Freedom existed, but only inside the covenant. Even after these conflicts, the Puritan colonies continued to grow. More ships arrived from England carrying families seeking the same moral community. Across New England, new towns rose from the wilderness. For many settlers, the Covenant Society worked remarkably well. Order, stability, and shared purpose helped communities thrive. The colony became one of the most organized societies in the New World. But over time, the colony faced a quieter challenge. The children of the first settlers did not share the same intense religious commitment. A new generation was growing up. Many younger colonists had been born in America. They had never experienced the struggle that brought their parents across the ocean. The Covenant Society was beginning to change. Church leaders worried that declining religious commitment could weaken the entire colony. If the covenant faded, so might the moral order of society. In response, Puritan leaders introduced a compromise known as the halfway covenant. It allowed the children of church members to participate partially in the religious community. The decision helped preserve the community for another generation. But it also revealed something important. Even covenant societies must adapt to survive. Over time, New England society became more diverse and more complex. New ideas arrived along with new settlers. Trade expanded, commerce grew. The rigid Puritan world slowly began to soften. Yet the Puritan Experiment left a powerful legacy. Their towns practiced self-government through local assemblies. Citizens learned to govern themselves. Their emphasis on literacy shaped American education. Schools and colleges appeared throughout New England. Their belief in moral responsibility influenced American political thought. Freedom required discipline. Liberty required virtue. Later generations would debate these ideas intensely. Some would defend ordered liberty. Others would push toward broader individual freedom. But the Puritans had already planted an important seed. They believed liberty could not survive without moral foundations. Their society was not perfect. It struggled with dissent, conformity, and human nature. Yet their experiment asked a question that still echoes today. Can freedom survive without shared moral responsibility? The Puritans believed liberty meant living under God's order, not doing whatever one wished. Their answer shaped the early American story, and the debate continues.
The first world was stern, literate, covenantal, and serious about moral order. But America would never be built from New England alone.
In early America, liberty didn't belong to everyone. In the South, it belonged to the few. They built mansions along the river, wide estates, imported wealth, power that stretched as far as the eye could see. But just beyond those estates, something else was growing. Anger, resentment, and a very different idea of liberty. Here, liberty didn't mean equality. It meant independence for those who had power. In 1676, that anger exploded. Armed men marched on their own capital and burned it to the ground. Why would English settlers destroy their own colony? And what does that tell us about liberty in early America? Because from the very beginning, Americans did not agree on what liberty meant. And when those visions collided, it didn't end in debate. To understand what happened, we have to go back to a very different vision of freedom. A vision built on land, hierarchy, and power. Not all settlers came to America seeking religious purity or communal order. Some came to recreate something else entirely. They were known as Cavaliers, royalists, aristocrats, men who believed society should be led by those born to rule. When they arrived in Virginia, they didn't build tight communities, they built estates. Land meant power, and power meant independence from interference. To them, liberty was not about equality. It was about being left alone to rule your domain. The greater your land, the greater your freedom, and the fewer people who could tell you what to do. This was a different kind of liberty than the Puritans. Not moral discipline, but personal authority. The Puritans believed liberty required order. The Cavaliers believed liberty required status. Freedom was something you possessed, not something everyone shared. And maintaining that freedom required control. over land, over labor, over society itself. But this system had a problem. It created two very different worlds inside the same colony. Along the rivers lived the elite, wealthy, protected, politically powerful. But further inland, life looked very different. Small farmers, isolated families, constant danger. They faced threats the elites rarely saw: conflict, uncertainty, and survival without protection. The frontier settlers were not asking for luxury, they were asking for protection. The system didn't just fail them, it abandoned them. Raids and violence were part of daily life, and help from the colonial government rarely came. The men who governed Virginia lived far away from these dangers, and their priorities looked very different. Governor Sir William Berkeley had ruled for decades, and he governed for stability, not expansion. He feared that pushing further into the frontier would provoke more conflict, so he chose restraint. To the elite, this was responsible leadership. To the settlers, it felt like abandonment. The farther you lived from power, the less protection you received, and the more your idea of liberty began to change. For the elite, liberty meant being left alone to rule. For the frontier, liberty meant survival. And survival without protection does not feel like freedom. It feels like neglect. Resentment began to spread, quiet at first, then louder. This wasn't just a conflict in Virginia, it was an early warning of a question America would never fully escape. Into that tension stepped a young man with ambition and a willingness to act where others would not. His name was Nathaniel Bacon, and he would become the voice of that anger. Nathaniel Bacon saw what the frontier settlers saw: danger without protection, authority without accountability. But he also saw something else, an opportunity. He promised action, immediate, forceful, unapologetic. To the settlers, he looked like leadership. To the elite, he looked like rebellion. Nathaniel Bacon demanded the right to organize a militia, to take the fight to the frontier. Governor Sir William Berkeley refused. He saw something dangerous in Bacon's rise, because once people take power into their own hands, it rarely stops where it begins. But Nathaniel Bacon didn't wait. He acted anyway. What began as frontier defense quickly became something more: a challenge to authority itself. The line between protecting liberty and seizing power began to blur. In 1676, the conflict reached its breaking point. Bacon's forces marched on Jamestown, and when they took the city, they made a decision that would echo through history. This was not a revolution for independence. It was a rebellion born from competing visions of liberty. The elite saw liberty as order and control. The frontier saw liberty as protection and action. And when those visions collided, there were no institutions strong enough to contain it. A truth had surfaced. Liberty without balance leads to instability. Too much control breeds resentment. Too little control breeds chaos. And somewhere between those extremes, a new idea would eventually emerge. Can a society hold together when its people define liberty in completely different ways? Or does that tension inevitably lead to conflict? Eventually, though, the tension broke, not in debate, but in fire. A rebellion, led not by kings, but by men who believed liberty had been denied to them. And what happened next would expose a truth the South could no longer ignore.
The Southern world carried land, rank, leadership, and local power. It also carried a warning about hierarchy, dependence, and liberty for the few.
They burned their own capital. Jamestown, once the seat of English power in Virginia, reduced to ash by the very men it was meant to govern. Not a foreign army, not a distant king, but English settlers rebelling against their own government. How does a society built on liberty turn on itself? How does frustration become violence? Because this wasn't just a rebellion, it was something more dangerous. It was the moment when trust collapsed, and when liberty, unmoored from order, turned into force. To understand how it happened, we have to return to a divided society already under strain. In Virginia, power belonged to a small group of elite planners, men who controlled land, trade, and government. They governed from the coast, protected by wealth, distance, and influence. But far from the river, on the frontier, life was very different. There, survival came without protection. Raids were common, violence unpredictable, and when settlers asked for help, they often received nothing. The government that claimed authority over them seemed unwilling to defend them. And over time, frustration hardened into something more dangerous. At the center of this rising anger stood a man named Nathaniel Bacon. He wasn't a poor farmer, he was educated, connected, part of the colonial elite, but he saw what others in power ignored, and he was willing to act. Opposing him was Governor William Berkeley, a loyal servant of the crown, and a man determined to maintain order at all costs. To Berkeley, unauthorized violence was chaos. To Bacon, inaction was betrayal. And between them, a society already beginning to fracture. At first, Bacon demanded permission. He asked the governor to authorize action against frontier threats. But Berkeley refused. He feared that uncontrolled violence would tear the colony apart. To him, restraint was necessary, even if it meant leaving settlers exposed. To Bacon, it looked very different. It looked like abandonment. And so he made a decision that would change everything. He would act with or without approval. He raised a militia, not sanctioned by the government, but driven by anger and fear. Men who felt forgotten. Men who believed the system no longer served them. And for the first time, they began to act together, not as subjects, but as a force. What began as defense was quickly becoming something else. Because once violence is unleashed, it rarely stays contained. Berkeley saw the danger immediately. This was no longer about protection. It was about control and who had the right to use force. So the governor declared Bacon a rebel, an enemy of the colony. But by then, Bacon was no longer alone. Support for the rebellion spread quickly, not just on the frontier, but across the colony. Because the grievance wasn't isolated, it was shared. And in that moment, the balance of power began to shift. The government still held authority, but it was losing control. Two visions of order now stood in opposition, one rooted in hierarchy, the other in force. And the question was no longer whether conflict would come, but how far it would go. By the summer of 1676, Virginia was no longer stable. Authority had fractured, and both sides were preparing for confrontation. Bacon marched toward Jamestown, not to petition, but to confront. The capital of the colony, the seat of government. Berkeley fled, unable to hold the city against the growing rebellion. And for a brief moment, power belonged to Bacon. But control built on force was never secure, because the same anger that drives a rebellion can also consume it. And then, they made a decision that would define the rebellion forever. They burned it. Their own capital, reduced to ash. Not seized, not reclaimed, destroyed. In that moment, the line between order and rebellion disappeared. This was no longer about protection or even justice. It was about power and what happens when no one agrees who should hold it. The rebellion would not last. It would fracture and collapse. But the damage had already been done. Trust, once broken, does not easily return. Because this was the lesson Virginia learned the hard way. A system that excludes too many eventually loses its legitimacy. And when legitimacy disappears, force rushes in to take its place. This is what happens when a hierarchical liberty loses its foundation. Not reform, not compromise, but violence. Because liberty without trust and shared belief cannot hold. And when it breaks, it doesn't fade quietly, it burns.
Bacon's rebellion revealed something deeper. A society could resist authority and still fail to become free. Part 2. Other experiments tried different answers. Some trusted conscience, some trusted trade, some trusted local courage and distance from power.
They would not bow, they would not swear loyalty, and they would not fight. For that, they were fined, beaten, imprisoned, and sometimes killed. Not because they were violent, but because they refused to conform. The danger they posed was not military, it was moral. They believed no earthly power had the right to force belief. That idea was radical enough in England. In America, it would become an experiment. And not just in religion, but in society itself. In earlier chapters, we met two other visions of liberty. The Puritans sought moral order through shared belief. The Cavaliers built order through hierarchy, land, and rank. The Quakers rejected both. They did not want enforced unity, and they did not trust inherited authority. They believed every person carried an inner light. Truth did not belong only to rulers, priests, or magistrates. It could speak through ordinary souls. That changed everything. How they understood religion, how they understood authority itself. They were not simply a sect with unusual beliefs. They were a distinct kind of people. And if given the chance, they meant to live differently. Among them was William Penn. He was no desperate exile from the margins. He was educated, connected, and born near power. But Penn came to believe that coercion corrupted both faith and government. A society worth building would have to leave conscience free. That was the gamble. Then he was given land in the New World, a vast tract in North America, enough space to test whether this vision could actually live. Not a society held together by fear, not one governed by rigid rank, but one held together by agreement. That sounds simple when said quickly. It was not simple at all. Agreement had to be built into daily life. There were no mandatory churches, no forced attendance, no required belief. Religion still mattered deeply, but it was not imposed from above, it was meant to be chosen. Authority existed, but it was restrained. Power depended more on consent than fear. Order did not come from fear. It came from shared agreement and mutual restraint. People were expected to govern themselves. That shaped property as well. Land was not supposed to be pure seizure. Wanted legitimacy, not just possession. And so the Quakers did something unusual in the colonial world. They negotiated with the Native Americans already there. They treated them as parties to agreement. This was not sentimental idealism floating above reality. It was practical coexistence. Peace was better for conscience and better for settlement. For a time, it worked remarkably well. Trade replaced raids. Trust replaced some of the fear that haunted other frontiers. That does not mean everything was perfect. It means the colony tried a different path, and for a while, the path held. For a time, the experiment looked remarkably successful. Pennsylvania grew quickly. People came not just for land, but for breathing room. The colony offered something rare in the colonial world: relative peace, religious tolerance, and the chance to build a life without constant coercion. Philadelphia began to rise. Trade expanded. The Quaker experiment no longer looked like a fragile dream at the edge of the wilderness. But success changes every experiment. The more Pennsylvania grew, the less purely Quaker it became. More migrants arrived. Not all of them shared Quaker habits. Many wanted the freedoms of the colony more than the discipline that made those freedoms possible. A society founded by Quakers was becoming a society not made up only of Quakers. That changed the character of the colony, even before it changed its laws. This was the hidden vulnerability in the system. Agreement depends on shared habits, and shared habits are hardest to preserve in success. The original Quaker settlers had built their world around restraint. They did not simply want freedom, they wanted freedom governed from within. But many later arrivals did not inherit that same instinct. They might accept the colony's liberties without sharing the inner discipline that sustained them. And Pennsylvania did not live outside history. The frontier still existed. Neighboring colonies still thought in terms of force, rank, and fear. A peaceful colony still had to survive in a dangerous world. That made security a harder question than conscience alone could answer. What happens when people committed to peace must govern a larger, more exposed, more diverse society? What happens when liberty must do more than simply refuse coercion? The Quakers had proved something real. Pluralism was possible. Coexistence was possible. Agreement could hold more than many believed. But they also revealed the cost. A society built on consent depends on habits it cannot force people to keep. That is what made their liberty both noble and fragile. It solved the problem of coerced conscience better than almost anyone. But it could not make trust automatic. The Puritans answered disorder with unity. The Cavaliers answered it with hierarchy. The Quakers answered it with agreement. Each answer solved something. Each answer carried a cost. And that is why these factions matter. Because the deeper question did not go away. If belief is no longer forced, what then holds liberty together?
The Quaker experiment showed the beauty of restraint. It also showed how fragile trust can be when the world becomes harder.
If you walked the streets of Lower Manhattan before it was New York, you would not find an English town, a Puritan village, or a planter world. You would find a Dutch port. It was loud, crowded, commercial. You would hear different languages in the street, see traders from different backgrounds, and feel almost immediately that this place was unlike the other colonies. That mattered, because from the beginning, America was not one culture becoming one nation. It was rival worlds growing beside one another. In earlier chapters, we met the Puritans, the Cavaliers, and the Quakers. The Puritans tied liberty to moral order and shared belief. The Cavaliers tied it to hierarchy, land, and rank. The Quakers tied liberty to agreement. The Dutch merchants were different. They did not build their world around purity, and they did not build it around aristocracy. They built it around exchange, around contracts, around the restless energy of trade. That gave New Amsterdam a different kind of liberty. Not liberty through moral order, not liberty through hierarchy, not liberty through agreement, but liberty through trade. That sounds modern when said too quickly. It was not modern, and it was not sentimental. This was still an imperial colony, still a frontier, still a place where profit, power, and force could sit very close together. To understand these people, we have to go back to how New Netherland began. Because New Amsterdam was never just a town, it was a company colony. The Dutch West India Company did not cross the Atlantic to create a holy commonwealth. It came for trade, for shipping lanes, for profit. That shaped everything from the start. Authority felt more corporate than sacred, more transactional than paternal. People were not drawn only by doctrine. They came for land, opportunity, trade, and movement. This was a colony built to make things happen. And so from early on, New Amsterdam felt less like a village of one people and more like a rough commercial crossroads, a place where strangers had to learn to live beside one another quickly. That gave the colony one of its most striking features. Diversity was not an accident at the edges. It was built into daily life. Religion, too, had to be handled differently here. Rigid unity was harder in a place this mixed. So tolerance often appeared less as a sermon and more as a practical necessity. That does not mean the Dutch were modern champions of universal liberty. They could be exclusive, they could be hard, but they often found it easier to live with difference than their neighbors did. In authority, they trusted administration. In property, they trusted contracts. In order, they trusted rules strong enough to keep commerce moving. That is what made this faction so distinct. The Dutch were trying to make difference livable through exchange, not by forcing agreement, but by making cooperation useful. There was something deeper in this than profit alone. Civilization is built on the human capacity to cooperate, and in New Amsterdam, that capacity was being tested in a rough, distant world where strangers had to build something together. That is one of the great powers of commerce. It does not require perfect agreement. It only requires enough trust, enough rules, and enough mutual benefit to make cooperation worth it. In that sense, the Dutch were tapping into something profoundly human. Not just the desire to possess, but the ability to divide labor, exchange value, and create more together than any one group could build alone. But that did not make New Amsterdam a polished success. Far from it. The colony could be disorderly, unstable, and poorly governed. Corporate colonies have their own weakness. A distant company may care more about profit than civic life, and the people living there eventually notice. That gap mattered, because a settlement can survive roughness for only so long. Eventually, someone has to impose order. That is where Peter Stuyvesant enters the story. Not as the founder of New Amsterdam, but as the man sent to harden it. He arrived in 1647. The colony he inherited was commercially promising, but politically and socially unsettled. He was not a soft man. He believed in discipline, in firmer authority, in making the colony function. That matters because New Amsterdam was not simply a city of free merchants making happy bargains. It needed government, and Stuyvesant meant to provide it. Under him, authority became more visible. The streets, markets, and public life of the colony were no longer left so loose. Trade still mattered, but order had to keep pace with growth. This is where Dutch authority becomes interesting. It was not Puritan authority, trying to save souls, and it was not Cavalier authority, defending inherited rank. It was administrative, urban, and practical. Religion remained more mixed than in many neighboring colonies. But tolerance was never unlimited. Even in New Amsterdam, power still drew lines. Property, meanwhile, remained central. Warehouses, docks, shipping, land claims, contracts, and commercial rights, these were the arteries of the colony. And where property and trade run deep, so do disputes. A commercial world does not eliminate conflict. It simply channels conflict into different forms. That is one reason New Amsterdam matters so much. It was teaching a colonial society how to live with difference, through bargaining, rules, and mutual usefulness. But we should not romanticize it. The Dutch world could also be coercive. This was still empire, still frontier, still power. Violence was not absent. It was simply less central to the faction's self-image than order, trade, and administration. When threatened, the Dutch could be hard. So what then held this world together? Not one church, not one ruling class, not one shared moral discipline. It was held together by exchange, by contracts, by civic rules, by the practical need to keep the port alive. And for a time, that was enough. New Amsterdam grew. It functioned. It became something unusually alive in the colonial world. But commercial cohesion has its limits. Prosperity can make difference livable. That does not always make loyalty deep. That weakness matters when harder power arrives. And in 1664, harder power did arrive. The English came for the colony. This was the pressure test the Dutch world could not avoid. When a society is held together largely by trade and administration, what is it willing to fight for? Stuyvesant wanted resistance, but many of the city's inhabitants were less eager to burn their prosperity in a doomed defense. That, too, tells us something. New Amsterdam had been held together by commerce, order, and usefulness. Those were real bonds. But they were not always the kind of bonds that turn prosperity into loyalty under pressure. New Amsterdam surrendered. It became New York. The Dutch lost political control of the colony. But that was not the end of the Dutch story. Because power changed hands faster than habits did, and some of the deepest habits of the place endured. The city remained commercial, plural, practical, suspicious of rigid uniformity. That inheritance matters. Because one of America's deepest urban instincts did not come from Puritan meeting houses or southern plantations. It came in part from this Dutch port. The Dutch merchants showed that people with different languages, backgrounds, and beliefs could live together and build something dynamic. Not because they agreed deeply, but because exchange made coexistence useful. That solved something real. It made diversity workable, it made prosperity possible, it made a city. But it also left a question. If trade is the glue, what happens when harder loyalties and harder power arrive? The Puritans built liberty through moral order, the Cavaliers through hierarchy, the Quakers through agreement, and the Dutch merchants through trade. Each faction solved a different problem. Each revealed a different weakness. And together, they help explain the strange inheritance that became America. Because the Constitution would later have to make peace among worlds like these. Not just among ideas, but among peoples who had learned very different ways of living together. And the Dutch merchants deserve their place in that story. Not as a footnote before English New York, but as one of the living factions that shaped the American experiment. The Scots-Irish Frontier experience was forged in a crucible of insecurity. Decades of raids, shifting alliances, and a distant authority that offered little protection had taught them a harsh lesson. Liberty was not a gift from afar. It was something seized, fiercely guarded, and maintained through personal strength and communal resilience. This was the spirit they carried across the ocean. Arriving in the American backcountry, they found a familiar landscape, isolated, dangerous, and again, far from the king's reach. They sought land and freedom, but often settled on insecure ground. Unlike the Puritans, who built their city on a hill with a strong central government, or the Quakers with their pacifist principles and ordered society, the Scots-Irish built their freedom from the ground up. Their institutions were kin, custom, and the rifle. Authority was earned, not inherited, and justice was often swift and personal. This was a society where autonomy was paramount. They did not trust distant governments, whether in London or Philadelphia, to understand their risks or defend their families. They had learned to trust themselves, their neighbors, and their God. Before they came to America, they had already learned a hard lesson. When law is weak and danger is close, freedom does not feel abstract. It feels like something you must defend yourself. These were people shaped by insecure ground. Raids, reprisals, clan memory, and contested land had taught them not to trust distance, promises, or polished authority. They did not grow up in tidy towns under strong institutions. They grew up where kin mattered, weapons mattered, and weakness invited trouble. That matters because people carry their worlds with them. And when the Scots-Irish crossed the Atlantic, they did not leave that world behind. They brought it into the American backcountry. If you followed them inland, you would not find a Dutch port, a Quaker town, or a Virginia estate. You would find cabins, ridgelines, thin roads, hard soil, and people living closer to danger than to government. This was a different America, not coastal, not refined, not comfortably governed. In earlier chapters, we met the Puritans, the Cavaliers, the Quakers, and the Dutch merchants. The Scots-Irish belonged to none of those worlds. Their liberty was not built on moral order, hierarchy, agreement, or trade. Their liberty was more personal than that, more local, more defensive. Liberty through autonomy. That did not mean they wanted chaos. It meant they trusted themselves more than distant rulers. They wanted room to stand on their own feet. To understand them, you have to see how they lived. Authority, religion, order, property, violence. None of these were abstractions on the edge of settlement. They were daily realities. Authority was not trusted just because it wore a title. It had to prove itself useful, local, and willing to share the same risks. That made distant elites look suspicious. Men in safer places making decisions for harder places. People on the edge noticed that quickly. Religion mattered deeply here, but not in the disciplined, orderly way of New England. Scots-Irish faith was often fiercer, more emotional, more bound to identity and endurance. The church was not just a place of doctrine. It was a place of memory, belonging, and moral seriousness in a world that could turn violent very quickly. Order, meanwhile, came less from institutions than from reputation. Family, neighbors, local custom, and the knowledge that weakness would be tested. That is a very different kind of order. Not absent, but improvised, local, and often harsh. Property mattered here too, but not as ornamental estate land, and not mainly as commercial opportunity. Land meant survival, independence, and a future for your children. A patch of land could mean meat in winter, crops in summer, and freedom from dependence. That made disputes over land and protection far more than legal questions. They were questions of whether you could live free at all. And then there was violence, not celebrated as a theory, but accepted as part of life. On the frontier, force was never far away. Raids, reprisals, feuds, and defense all shaped the imagination of the backcountry. A people raised this way would never see politics the same way as a port city or a plantation. This is what made the Scots-Irish so distinct. They were trying to secure liberty where institutions were weakest, and sometimes where they barely existed at all. That required resilience. It also required a high tolerance for friction. People who must govern themselves locally often become hard to govern from far away. And this is where the pressure enters, because the backcountry was rarely protected as well as it was taxed, counted, or ordered from the coast. People on the fringes suffer first when power centralizes badly. They feel the delay, the neglect, and the arrogance before anyone else does. The Scots-Irish knew that in their bones. Representation mattered here because risk was unequal. Men making decisions in safer places did not always understand what life cost on the edge. That is one reason suspicion of distant authority ran so deep. Not just because these people hated being told what to do, but because they believed distant power often failed to protect what it claimed to govern. This is where frontier autonomy becomes political. When institutions are weak, local loyalty grows stronger. And when centralized planning fails, people trust local judgment more than distant design. There is something admirable in that. The Scots-Irish could endure hardship, organize quickly, and defend their own when larger systems moved too slowly. But there was also something dangerous in it. A people who trust themselves more than institutions can become volatile when anger rises. Autonomy can defend liberty. It can also sharpen grievance. Their courage was real, their endurance was real, and so were their resentments. The Scots-Irish carried a powerful sense of honor. They also carried a willingness to answer insult, threat, or neglect directly. That made compromise harder once conflict had fully arrived. That is where this faction stood apart. Other colonial worlds, however imperfectly, built more restraint into daily life. The Scots-Irish built more of their liberty around direct response, local loyalty, and the refusal to back down. Self-government requires more than courage. It also requires restraint. And that was one of the hardest things for this frontier culture to sustain once anger had fully taken hold. This is one of the deepest recurring forces in American life. A people shaped where institutions were thin will always ask a hard question. Why should I trust rulers who do not share my risks? The Puritans built liberty through moral order. The Cavaliers built it through hierarchy. the Quakers through agreement, the Dutch through trade. The Scots-Irish built liberty through autonomy, not because autonomy is always highest in theory, but because in their world, dependence could be fatal. That solved something real. It created resilience where systems were weak. It made hard people harder to dominate. But it also created a weakness. A society built too much on autonomy can struggle to trust institutions even when good institutions are needed. That is the real trade-off. When people are left out, underprotected, and underrepresented, they become suspicious of power. Sometimes wisely, sometimes destructively. And this is why the Scots-Irish matter so much in the American story. Not as colorful background figures, but as a living faction with a lasting instinct, local over distant, autonomy over dependence, earned authority over imposed control. The Constitution would later have to contain energies like this, not erase them, not satisfy them completely, but make room for them without letting everything fracture. Because a nation built from rival worlds had to find peace among people who trusted very different things. Some trusted institutions. The Scots-Irish trusted character, kin, and local resolve. And that leaves the question they still force us to ask. When institutions grow distant, slow, and unresponsive, who suffers first? And who is left to carry liberty on their own shoulders? For the fight for liberty never ends. It only changes hands.
The Dutch showed how strangers could cooperate through trade. The frontier showed how freedom could survive far from permission. Part 3. Conscience, Fear, and Authority. The colonies did not only argue about taxes and trade, they argued about who had the right to command the soul.
It began in a village where people feared disorder almost as much as sin. Then suddenly, the children began screaming, twisting, and collapsing. And Salem started looking for an explanation. Not a distant frontier, not a great city. A tight moral community where everyone knew one another, watched one another, and judged one another. How does a people built on discipline and godly order descend into accusation, coercion, and death? How does fear become stronger than judgment? Because Salem was not just a story about superstition. It was a story about power. About what happens when moral certainty, civic authority, and communal fear all start feeding one another. To understand Salem, we have to return to the Puritan world itself. Not the caricature, the real thing. The Puritans believed liberty required moral order. A free people could not remain free, they thought, if they surrendered themselves to corruption, disorder, and hidden evil. Religion here was not private. It shaped law, status, reputation, and public life. The village stood under God together. That created real strengths, shared standards, discipline, a people who believed public life had moral meaning. But the same structure carried a danger. Religion and civic authority were closely fused. And when those powers move in the same direction, there are fewer breaks to stop them. Salem did not invent that danger. It revealed it. What happens when a morally serious people face fear without enough separation, friction, or procedural restraint to slow the spiral? The first disturbances emerged in the household of Samuel Parris, a minister already living under tension, scrutiny, and local division. The children in his home showed strange symptoms, convulsions, outcries, fits no one around them could explain. Modern observers have proposed possible medical explanations, including contaminated grain. That theory remains disputed. And even if some physical cause played a role, it does not explain what the village did next. What mattered in Salem was not only that something frightening may have been happening, it was how a morally charged community interpreted fear once it arrived. And Salem was already a place of strain. Local rivalries, property disputes, household resentments, village factions. That matters because panic does not descend on a blank slate. It spreads through tensions already waiting for a shape. Soon, suspicion turned toward witchcraft. Not because Salem was uniquely foolish, but because within its worldview, invisible evil was not absurd. It was terrifyingly plausible. That is what makes Salem tragic. Serious people trying to explain something frightening and reaching for the most dangerous explanation they had. At first, the accusations looked containable. A few names, a few suspects, a few examinations. But once accusation becomes socially powerful, it changes the system around it. People learn quickly what fear rewards. and what it punishes. This is where restraint should have entered. Careful evidence, procedural friction, distance between panic and punishment. But Salem's structure lacked enough of those breaks. Its religious and civic authorities were too closely aligned. Its moral imagination was too ready to see hidden corruption. Its institutions were too local and too fused to slow themselves. So suspicion spread, not outward into wildness, but inward, deeper into the community itself. The violence of Salem was not frontier violence. It was not a mob in the open field. It was legal violence, institutional violence. Coercion clothed in order. Arrest, examination, imprisonment, condemnation. This is one reason Salem matters so much. It shows how injustice can wear the clothing of lawful procedure, while moral certainty keeps calling it righteousness. Once fear fuses with authority, innocence becomes harder to defend. Denying guilt looks suspicious. Confusion looks suspicious. Silence looks suspicious. That is how a system turns. Not because every person becomes monstrous, but because fear, group loyalty, and concentrated power stop checking one another. And Salem was vulnerable to tribalism. A small world where trust was already thin in places. A world where belonging mattered, and falling outside the moral boundary could become fatal. Some of the accused were already socially exposed. Some carried reputations, disputes, or differences that made them easier to suspect once panic began. That is why property and local grievance should not disappear from the story. Even in a religious panic, ordinary rivalries can help decide who gets dragged into the fire. So Salem was never just about theology. It was theology passing through a real community, with jealousies, ambitions, resentments, and fear already waiting underneath. Executions followed, and with them something deeper began to break. Not just bodies, but confidence. At some point, the trials went too far to ignore. Too many names, too much reach, too much certainty built on too little restraint. And that is often how panic ends. Not with a reason winning elegantly, but with a system finally encountering the scale of its own excess. The village had not become godless. It had become unguarded against itself. Its confidence in righteousness had outrun its capacity for judgment. This is the structural lesson beneath the tragedy. The problem was not merely that frightened people lacked self-control. The deeper problem was that Salem had too little separation between spiritual certainty, communal pressure, and legal punishment. Too much concentrated moral and civic authority in the same hands creates danger. When there are too few checks, too little friction, and too little independent judgment, panic can become policy. That is one of Salem's most enduring warnings. A community may be sincere. Its leaders may be serious. Its moral concerns may even begin in something real. And still, the system can become unjust. This is why Salem should matter beyond the village itself. It helps explain why later Americans grew more wary of fusing sacred certainty too tightly with public coercion. Not because religion no longer mattered, but because a free people would need stronger barriers against concentrated certainty, concentrated power, and concentrated fear. The Puritans had built liberty through moral order. Salem revealed the danger inside that model. A society can be morally serious and still become unjust when judgment loses restraint and power lacks enough checks. That does not erase what the Puritans built. But it does expose the cost of a structure too fused to stop itself once fear had spread. Salem is not merely a warning about superstition. It is a warning about tribal panic, procedural weakness, and public power without enough internal restraint. And that leaves the deeper question. How does a free people preserve moral seriousness without letting certainty destroy justice?
Salem showed what happens when fear becomes public power. A frightened community can mistake accusation for truth.
Before the colonies rebelled against kings, many first learned to challenge something closer to home: inherited religious authority. And one of the first signs was simple. A name began moving from town to town. George Whitefield is coming. The word spread across ports, villages, farms, and market towns. People who had never seen one another before now anticipated the same voice. That mattered more than it may sound. The colonies were still scattered, jealous, regional, and often deeply different. But suddenly, a single preacher could make them look in the same direction. What happens when a scattered people begin sharing the same moral experience? What happens when ordinary colonists start trusting awakened conscience more than inherited gatekeepers? That is one of the great hidden stories before the American founding. To understand the Great Awakening, you have to begin with the religious world that existed before it. Christianity was already everywhere in the colonies. Churches mattered, scripture mattered, preaching mattered. This was not a godless society waiting for religion to arrive. It was a deeply Christian world, though divided by region, denomination, and temperament. There were many institutions, but there were also many shared assumptions. Sin was real. Repentance mattered. Salvation mattered. The Bible carried weight. In that sense, the colonies still lived inside a broader Protestant Christian world. But in many places, religious authority had settled into familiar forms. Established churches, learned ministers, inherited deference. A faith that could be sincere but also formal, cooled, or routine. That is the tension the awakening would strike. Not Christianity versus unbelief, but living faith versus inherited form. Awakened conscience versus mediated authority. Then Whitefield arrived, not first as a politician, not first as a theorist, but as a voice that seemed to reach straight past hierarchy and into the conscience of ordinary people. He did not stay inside old walls if the walls were too small. He preached in fields, commons, roadsides, and open spaces. That alone changed the feel of religious authority. This was religion in public, but not religion under one local gatekeeper. It was mobile, trans-colonial, less controlled by the old boundaries of parish and place. And people came. Farmers, artisans, merchants, women, young people, those who felt spiritually alive and those who feared they were spiritually asleep. Some rode for miles to hear him. Some stood in tears. Some trembled. Some felt condemned. Others felt, perhaps for the first time, directly addressed. That directness is the key. The awakening did not simply tell people what to believe. It made them feel that faith had to be real, personal, inward, and immediate. Once that happens, authority changes. If the soul can be awakened directly, then old gatekeepers lose some of their monopoly. A minister is no longer obeyed simply because he occupies the office. That did not destroy the church, but it did weaken inherited deference. Ordinary people began judging religious leaders more boldly, more personally, and more openly than before. Jonathan Edwards helps us see the other side of the movement. He was not Whitefield's twin, less theatrical, more inward, more intellectually severe. But Edwards understood the same deeper crisis. Too many people had inherited religion outwardly without feeling its weight inwardly. The awakening, in his world too, was about conscience made alive. Whitefield gave the movement wings. Edwards gave it depth. Together, they reveal that the Great Awakening was not just noise. It was a serious struggle over what faith, authority, and conviction should mean. And print carried it farther still. Journals, letters, sermon extracts, printed reports, and newspaper accounts turned revival into a moving colonial event. People who never saw Whitefield still heard about him. That matters because the colonies were not yet a nation. But now thousands of people in distant places were responding to one shared moral drama. That is a different kind of formation. One of the first things the awakening did was make scattered people feel spiritually connected across distance. That connection was not yet political unity, but it was more than nothing. It was shared experience, and not everyone welcomed it. Established ministers feared disorder. Some feared spectacle. Some feared emotional excess. Some feared that charisma was outrunning discipline. Those fears were not entirely imaginary. The awakening could become unruly. Itinerant preachers could denounce settled ministers too easily. Crowds could mistake intensity for truth. This is one of the movement's trade-offs. It awakened conscience from below. But once people become less deferential, structure becomes harder to preserve. Authority weakens faster than replacement arrives. Congregations split. Old lights and new lights accused one another. Families, towns, and churches argued over whether revival was the breath of God or the beginning of disorder. That division mattered because it revealed something larger. The colonies were becoming more morally serious, but also more difficult to manage through inherited forms alone. A new kind of people was taking shape. This is where faction matters again. The awakening did not erase the rival colonial worlds. It ran through them, and each received it in its own way. In New England, revival landed in a world already shaped by moral seriousness, sermon culture, and communal discipline. The emotional force was new. The religious intensity was not. In the middle colonies, more plural and commercially connected, revival moved through a looser religious landscape. It had more room to travel. And in traveling, it linked difference without erasing it. In the backcountry, where Scots-Irish Protestant culture already distrusted distant authority and prized direct conviction, revival could strike with unusual force. Here, emotional religion and anti-elite instinct could reinforce one another. So the awakening did not create one uniform colonial religion. It intensified old instincts, loosened old controls, and connected distant people through a shared language of conviction. And beneath all of that was a deeper shift in authority. If truth could pierce conscience directly, then office alone was no longer enough. Rank alone was no longer enough. Inherited standing alone was no longer enough. That is not yet a revolution, but it is a change in posture. A people who learn to assess religious gatekeepers for themselves will not remain forever passive before other gatekeepers either. That connection should not be exaggerated. The Great Awakening did not cause independence by itself, but it did alter how many colonists experienced obedience, authority, judgment, and legitimacy. It made some people more willing to ask, who truly speaks with authority? What makes obedience legitimate? And when should a soul resist dead form, empty office, or unearned command? Those are religious questions, but they do not stay only religious. Once a people begins to ask them seriously, the habit can travel. The awakening also did something else. It made the colonies more morally intense, not calmer, not softer. More searching, more demanding, more conscious of judgment and sincerity. That moral intensity could be fruitful. It could also be divisive. It deepened seriousness, but it did not guarantee harmony. Awakened conscience can unify and unsettle at the same time. So what problem did the Great Awakening solve? It challenged stale religious form. It spoke to ordinary people directly. It cut through inherited distance and made faith feel immediate again. And what weakness did it create? It made charisma more powerful, institutions less secure, deference harder to recover. Once awakened, conscience does not easily go back to sleep. This is why the awakening matters in the larger American story. It did not erase the rival colonial worlds, but it did pass through them, stir them, and leave them changed. The colonies that emerged from this movement were more connected than before, more morally serious than before, more divided than before, and in a quiet but real sense, more independent-minded than before. That does not mean all authority became illegitimate. It means authority now had to persuade more deeply. Inherited office alone was losing some of its old protection. And that is one of the great changes before the founding. Not only new ideas, not only new grievances, but a people learning, emotionally and spiritually, to look authority in the eye. The Great Awakening did not produce a simple, unified America. It produced something more complicated, a more awakened people, a less obedient people, a harder people to govern by inherited deference alone. And that leaves the deeper question. What happens to a society when conscience wakes up faster than its institutions can adapt? What kind of freedom follows that kind of awakening? The Great Awakening made America more morally serious, more divided, and more independent-minded. That is why it belongs in the story before the Revolution, not just in the story of religion.
The Great Awakening stirred the colonies in another way. Ordinary people began to believe they could judge authority for themselves.
Before America separated church and state, it first lived inside a world where both were expected to matter. Churches mattered. Scripture mattered. Public life was saturated with Christian language. This is important to understand. The colonies did not move toward separation because they stopped caring about religion. They moved that way while religion still shaped nearly everything. Many colonists crossed the Atlantic not to escape faith, but to escape domination exercised through the union of sacred authority and political power. They were not fleeing God. They were fleeing coercion. And that points to a distinction the colonies would slowly learn the hard way. Government governs by force. Religion speaks to conscience. When government acts, it always rests on coercive power in the end. Law can fine, imprison, punish, banish, and compel. Even good government carries force behind it. Religion, if it is genuine, works differently. It calls for conviction, repentance, obedience, surrender, and belief. Things that lose their meaning when produced only by force. That does not mean religion should have no public place. In colonial America, it clearly did. It means the powers of church and state are different in kind. When those powers are fused, both are endangered. The state borrows moral absolutism, the church borrows coercive force, and conscience gets trapped between them. No colony tested that more clearly than Massachusetts Bay. The Puritans came with a serious vision. They did not want chaos. They wanted a godly commonwealth. They believed liberty required moral order. A people could not remain free, they thought, if corruption hollowed out the soul of the community. That was not an absurd concern. It was a real political insight. And for a time, that seriousness gave Massachusetts Bay real strength. Discipline, cohesion, public purpose. A sense that liberty and virtue belonged together. But the Puritans did more than honor religion. They institutionalized it. Church membership, public standing, political order, and moral supervision sat very close together. That was the structural danger. Not that religion mattered too much, but that sacred authority and civic authority were arranged too tightly in the same frame. The Puritans believed that if they sought God seriously enough and ordered society around that duty, they could build something close to a righteous commonwealth. In one sense, that aspiration was noble. In another, it pushed the structure too far. Because once a society gives moral certainty strong civic power, dissent becomes harder to classify. It is no longer just disagreement. It begins to look like danger. Roger Williams exposed that problem early. He was not asking for chaos. He was asking whether conscience could remain free when civil authority helped enforce religious conformity. Williams argued that the soul does not belong to the magistrate, that civil power should govern civil things, and that forcing conscience corrupts both church and state. That was a dangerous argument in Massachusetts Bay, because if conscience stands partly outside the reach of the state, then the whole godly commonwealth becomes less unified than the founders had hoped. So Roger Williams was banished, not because the colony hated religion, but because it feared what uncontrolled dissent might do to a morally ordered society. Anne Hutchinson revealed the problem in another way. Her challenge was not merely personal. It struck at the authority of those who believed they were guarding the community's moral and spiritual health. When spiritual authority and civic order are intertwined, a challenge to one quickly becomes a challenge to both. That is what made dissent so combustible. The structure had too little room for principled disagreement. And this was not a one-colony curiosity. Across the broader colonial world, Christians were asking the same question in different forms. How can religion remain powerful without becoming coercively fused to public force? The Quakers answered by protecting conscience more radically. They did not abandon religion. They reduced coercion. The Dutch made practical room for religion in a more plural world. Their cities and ports could not function if every difference became a civic war. Trade made coexistence useful. The Scots-Irish, for their part, brought strong Christianity into a world suspicious of overbearing hierarchy. They did not reject faith. They distrusted structures that placed too much power over conscience in distant hands. Virginia lived with formal establishment more comfortably, but even there, the colonies were learning that church, community, and government did not always have to occupy the same institutional space. Massachusetts Bay remained the clearest experiment in fusion, and Salem would become its sharpest warning. Salem did not prove that Christianity was false. It proved that serious people in a serious faith can still become unjust when sacred certainty and civic coercion lose enough restraint. The problem was not only fear. The deeper problem was structure. Too little separation, too little friction, too little procedural restraint once panic began to spread. A society built on moral order had concentrated too much moral and civic authority in the same hands. And once fear accelerated, there were too few barriers to slow the spiral. Salem matters because it shows what happens when the state uses force in a realm where conscience, judgment, and moral humility should have remained central. Arrest, examination, punishment, all of it carried legal form. And still, justice failed. This is where the American lesson begins to sharpen. Not against religion, against concentrated power claiming both moral certainty and legal force. The colonies did not stop respecting Christianity. They did not stop reading the Bible. They did not stop believing that religion had a real place in public moral life. What they increasingly questioned was this: should the state be used coercively for explicitly religious ends? Should church power ride on the back of civil force? And their answer, over time, moved toward distinction. Not because religion was unimportant, but because its importance made coercive fusion even more dangerous. Religion could remain strong without controlling the machinery of punishment. Government could remain strong without claiming lordship over the soul. That was the balance the colonial experience gradually made visible. In one sense, this was a lesson about faith. In another, it was a lesson about power. Do not collapse too much authority into one structure, especially not authority that claims both righteousness and force. That instinct would later echo elsewhere: checks and balances, distributed powers, institutional friction, the belief that concentrated power is dangerous even when its intentions are sincere. And this is one reason the colonial story matters so much. The American order did not emerge from theory alone. It emerged from lived experiments, overreach, dissent, panic, and hard-earned correction. Massachusetts Bay gave one answer. Quaker Pennsylvania gave another. The Dutch, the Scots-Irish, and the Southern Colonies all added their own experience. Together, they pushed America toward a more complex arrangement of liberty, conscience, and power. The lesson was not to erase religion from public life. It was to keep church and state as distinct powers, so that conscience could remain free, churches could remain more than state instruments, and civil power could not so easily become morally absolute. That is why America separated church and state, not because it rejected Christianity, but because it learned that when government governs by force and religion speaks to conscience, neither should be made the weapon of the other. And that leaves the deeper question: how does a free people preserve moral seriousness without letting the state coerce the soul?
Part 4. The American mind begins to form. Ideas crossed the ocean, but in America, ideas had to survive distance, scarcity, argument, and daily life.
Most people know the Mayflower and most people know the Revolution. But between those two memories, something deeper happened. Before America became a nation, it became a way of thinking. Not one mind, not one culture, not one inherited tradition, a compound mind. It was built from rival colonial worlds: old world ideas, new world pressure, religious conviction, practical necessity, and the hard experience of trying things that sometimes worked and sometimes failed. This was the century when inherited wisdom became lived experiment. The people who came to America did not all come for the same reason, but many came with some version of a hypothesis. Could a people build something different here? Could old ideas work in new conditions? Could liberty become more than a theory? They did not answer those questions all at once. They answered them by building, arguing, failing, revising, and trying again. That is why the American mind was made. It was not born complete, it was tested into existence. By the 1700s, the colonies were no longer just fragile outposts on the edge of an empire. They had become schools of self-government. Town meetings, colonial assemblies, local courts, churches, committees, militias, clubs, libraries, fire companies. This was not self-government as a slogan. It was self-government as practice. People learned to govern by governing. They learned the strengths of local knowledge. They learned the dangers of distant control. They learned that order had to be built close to the ground. That practical experience changed the way they thought. The American mind became suspicious of power that ruled from too far away, because the colonies had learned how much life depended on local judgment. But localism alone was not enough. The American mind was also fed by old wisdom. Aristotle and the classical world had asked what kind of character a free people needed. Christian moral thought had insisted that rulers and subjects alike stood under moral judgment. English constitutional struggles had taught colonists to speak of rights, charters, law, representation, and limits on arbitrary power. The Enlightenment added confidence that reason could examine authority, test old assumptions, and ask whether power was legitimate. Natural rights gave the argument its deepest force. If rights were not gifts from rulers, then rulers could not be the final measure of justice. But these ideas did not remain in Europe. They crossed the ocean. They entered sermons, newspapers, letters, pamphlets, almanacs, taverns, churches, and assemblies. They were imported, but they were not merely copied. They were filtered through colonial experience. The American mind took old ideas and asked a new question. Will this work here? That is where Benjamin Franklin becomes so useful. Not because he was the whole American mind, but because he embodied so much of it. Franklin was a printer. And in the 18th century, a printer was not just a tradesman. He was a gatekeeper of public argument. The printing press helped turn scattered colonies into a thinking public. A sermon in one colony could be discussed in another. A pamphlet could challenge an official. An essay could teach ordinary readers to think politically. This mattered because command was no longer the only way ideas moved. Persuasion was becoming power. America was becoming a society of argument. Not always noble argument, not always wise argument, but public argument. Argument that could move across distance, enter households, and challenge authority. That is one reason Franklin matters. He did not only spread ideas, he organized people around them. Clubs, libraries, fire companies, civic projects, associations built from below. This became one of the habits of the American mind. Do not wait for distant authority to solve every problem. Associate, organize, improve. Franklin's world was experimental in the literal sense. He tested, observed, adjusted, improved. That practical instinct mattered. The American mind was not only theoretical, it was improvement-minded. It asked not only what is true, but also what can be built from this. That made the American mind different from a purely philosophical mind. It turned ideals into habits, and habits into institutions. The American mind was a compound mind. From the Puritans, it inherited moral seriousness, literacy, covenant, public duty, and the belief that a people must be formed, not merely freed. But it also learned from Puritan failure. Moral certainty without restraint could become coercion. From the Cavaliers, it inherited honor, local leadership, property, county government, and a fierce language of rights. But it also learned the limits of a liberty too closely tied to rank. From the Quakers, it inherited conscience, restraint, pluralism, peaceable order, and the idea that belief could not be forced. But it also learned that a society built on restraint could become fragile when pressure and conflict grew. From the Dutch, it inherited commerce, urban cooperation, practical tolerance, contracts, and the ability to live with difference through exchange. But it also learned that prosperity alone could not always create sacrifice, loyalty, or common purpose. From the Scots-Irish Frontier, it inherited autonomy, toughness, vigilance, local loyalty, and suspicion of distant power. But it also learned that liberty without institutions could become anger without restraint. This is why the American mind was not simple. It was not one clean doctrine. It was a compound mind, refined by competing inheritances. Competing instincts did not only divide America, they sharpened it. Moral order challenged pure self-interest. Conscience challenged coercion. Commerce challenged isolation. Autonomy challenged central control. Law challenged raw power. The American mind grew in the friction between them. Religion played a major role in this formation, but not only through institutions. The Great Awakening showed that ideas could move through ordinary people with enormous force. George Whitefield's preaching crossed colonial boundaries. It stirred conscience. It bypassed old gatekeepers. It made public persuasion feel electric. That mattered politically, even when the message was religious. A people trained to listen, compare, judge, and respond would not remain passive forever. Sermons, pamphlets, newspapers, and almanacs formed a kind of colonial nervous system. This did not create unity, but it created communication, and communication made broader cooperation possible. John Peter Zenger's world showed another piece of the mind being made, the belief that authority could be criticized in public. That did not mean speech was free in the modern sense, but it did mean public argument was becoming harder to suppress. James Otis represented another turn. The legal mind of the colonies was beginning to connect inherited rights with the resistance to arbitrary power. General searches, distant commands, power without consent. These were no longer just inconveniences. They were becoming violations of principle. John Dickinson showed still another side of the American mind, resistance with restraint. The colonists were not modern revolutionaries in costume. Many still argued as inheritors. They appealed to law, rights, charters, custom, and constitutional memory. That is what makes this story so important. The American mind did not begin by rejecting the past. It began by testing the past. It asked which old truths could survive in a new world, which institutions could be improved, which inheritances needed restraint, which principles could be carried farther. By the 1760s and 1770s, imperial pressure poured accelerant on this formation. Ideas that had been discussed for decades suddenly became urgent. Rights were no longer abstract. Representation was no longer academic. Consent was no longer a distant principle. The colonies had practiced enough self-government to know they were not helpless. They had argued enough to know they could persuade, associated enough to know they could organize, governed enough to know they could act. That confidence did not come from fantasy, it came from trial. For decades, they had been testing the habits of liberty. They learned that liberty needed virtue, but virtue needed restraint. They learned that property could support independence, but property could also harden into hierarchy. They learned that conscience could protect the soul, but conscience needed civic order to survive conflict. They learned that trade could make difference livable, but exchange alone could not answer every question of loyalty, sacrifice, or justice. They learned that autonomy could defend freedom, but autonomy without institutions could become unstable. This was the compound mind. It did not erase disagreement. It turned disagreement into a source of refinement. It did not invent liberty from nothing. It gathered old truths, tested them in new conditions, and discovered that some could be carried farther than anyone had dared. For the first time at real scale, a people began trying to build political order around liberty, rights, consent, and restrained power. Not perfectly, not completely, not without contradiction, but consciously. That is the part too often missed. America was not simply born in a battlefield. It was formed in print shops, churches, assemblies, farms, courts, clubs, markets, and frontier settlements. It was formed by people who inherited ideas, tested them, argued over them, and slowly became capable of acting on them. Before America could declare independence, it had to learn how to think like a people capable of self-government. That was the making of the American mind. A compound mind, built from inheritance, refined by experience, and tested by liberty.
The American mind was not born in a classroom. It was made in pulpits, print shops, courtrooms, taverns, assemblies, and arguments.
A printer sat in jail because a governor wanted his criticism silenced. A merchant watched government officers search his property without naming a specific crime. A Virginia jury answered royal power with a verdict worth 1 penny. Baptist preachers sat behind bars because they preached without government approval. John Dickinson stood against independence even after helping lead resistance to Britain. And John Adams defended British soldiers after 5 colonists lay dead in Boston. These were different fights, but each forced the same question into real life. What happens when liberty meets someone who can actually tell you no? America did not invent liberty from nothing. Colonists inherited centuries of ideas about law, rights, conscience, representation, and limits on rulers. But an ocean separated them from the government that supposedly had the final word. A question sent to London could take months to travel there, be answered, and return. So colonists often had to govern, decide, argue, and solve problems before London could answer. That gave old ideas room to be tested in ways they rarely had been before. The first test came from something every ruler dislikes: public criticism. In colonial New York, Governor William Cosby had made plenty of enemies. A newspaper printed by John Peter Zenger accused Cosby of abusing his office. Cosby did what powerful men had done for centuries when criticism became inconvenient. He tried to shut it down. Copies were publicly burned, but the criticism kept spreading. So in 1734, Zenger was arrested and locked in jail. The government had the law largely on its side. Under the rules of seditious libel, proving the criticism was true did not automatically save the printer. Then an older lawyer named Andrew Hamilton stood before the jury. Hamilton admitted Zenger had printed the words and asked the jury to judge whether the criticism was true. The judge told the jurors their job was much narrower. The jurors ignored that narrow path and found Zenger not guilty. The trial did not suddenly create a complete freedom of the press, but the American expectation had moved. Government criticism deserved room to survive. A generation later, liberty walked through another door. British customs officers were fighting smuggling with documents called writs of assistance. These were broad search powers, not warrants focused on one named person or one specific place. To a Boston merchant, the argument about rights suddenly looked like officers opening his property. James Otis had been expected to defend that power for the crown. Instead, he resigned his royal office and argued against it. In 1761, Otis stood in Boston's courtroom and attacked the writs as arbitrary power. His point was bigger than customs enforcement. If government could search wherever it wished, then private property had no real boundary around it. Otis argued that even government acting under law could possess too much power. A 25-year-old lawyer named John Adams listened from the room. Adams never forgot the force of what he heard. Otis lost and the writs remained. But another American expectation had moved. Legitimate power needed limits. 2 years later, a Virginia courtroom turned a pay dispute into a fight over who really governed. Virginia paid Anglican ministers partly in tobacco. When tobacco prices exploded, Virginia temporarily changed how those salaries were calculated. The Crown overturned Virginia's law from across the Atlantic. Reverend James Morey sued for the money he believed he was still owed. The court had already ruled that Morey was legally entitled to damages. Patrick Henry's job was only to argue how much money Morey should receive. Instead, the 27-year-old lawyer attacked the larger question behind the case. What did self-government mean if distant authority could simply erase a law Virginians had made for themselves? The jury could not undo the Crown's decision, but it could decide what that victory was worth. They awarded Morey 1 penny. Henry walked out famous, and another line had been crossed. Representation was starting to mean more than having local officials who could be overruled whenever London wished. Then liberty reached somewhere government had long claimed authority: the human conscience. Virginia had an established church, and dissenting preachers could be punished for preaching outside its rules. Some Baptist ministers were arrested and jailed simply for preaching without official approval. A young James Madison could see this happening near his own home. He was only in his early 20s, but the sight enraged him. The problem was not that Virginia lacked religious toleration. The problem was that toleration still assumed government had the right to give permission. Madison began pushing towards something stronger. Conscience should not depend on permission from the state. In 1776, Madison helped replace the language of toleration with the language of free exercise. That change sounds small until you understand what it means. Toleration says government lets you worship. Liberty of conscience says your belief was never government's to grant. Another part of life was moving beyond the proper reach of political power. By the 1770s, Americans were getting very good at explaining what government should not do. John Dickinson forced them to face a harder question: what should resistance not do? Dickinson had been one of colonial America's strongest voices against British taxation. His letters from a farmer in Pennsylvania were read across the colonies. He believed Britain was violating colonial rights, but he also believed a just cause could destroy itself if anger replaced judgment. He backed petitions, boycotts, and organized resistance while still trying to avoid a final break. He helped push one last appeal to the king through the Olive Branch Petition. By 1776, most of Congress was moving past him. He believed independence was coming before the colonies were united, prepared, and secure enough to survive it. So Dickinson opposed independence. Then Congress chose independence anyway. Dickinson accepted the decision and joined the militia. He later drafted an early version of the Articles of Confederation. His lesson was uncomfortable but essential. Opposing arbitrary power did not make your own judgment automatically right. Then Boston gave that idea its hardest test. British soldiers had been stationed in a city already furious with British rule. On March 5th, an angry crowd surrounded a small group of soldiers. Snowballs, debris, insults, threats, and fear filled the street. Then shots rang out. 5 colonists eventually died. Boston wanted the soldiers punished, and few lawyers wanted their names attached to the defense. John Adams took the case anyway. America was about to learn whether liberty protected only the people it liked. Adams asked the jury to judge evidence instead of anger, because liberty also had to restrain the people exercising power. By the time Americans began building a new government, these were no longer just ideas. They were lessons people had paid to learn. The Constitution and Bill of Rights did not invent those lessons. They gave them structure. For most of history, power defined the limits of liberty. America was attempting something different. Liberty would define the limits of power.
When liberty met power, The old ideas became practical. Speech, conscience, law, and resistance were no longer theories.
American freedom did not begin in 1776. It began when colonists started ruling themselves. Before Americans declared independence, they were already doing something more important than talking about liberty. They were practicing it. Not in grand theories, but in muddy meeting houses, local courts, county assemblies, and hard arguments among neighbors. Imagine a town meeting in New England. A bridge needs repair, a road needs clearing, a militia needs supplies. A tax must be approved by people who will actually feel it. This was not abstract democracy. This was self-government in practice. Messy, local, imperfect, and immediate. How did the colonies become capable of independence? Part of the answer is simple. For generations, they had been governing themselves long before they imagined becoming a nation. And that matters. Because liberty survives differently in a people who merely admire self-rule than in a people who have already learned how to do it. In earlier episodes, we met rival colonial worlds. Puritans built liberty through moral order, Cavaliers through hierarchy, Quakers through agreement, Dutch merchants through trade, Scots-Irish through autonomy. But across many of those differences, another habit was growing. People in the colonies were increasingly used to making decisions nearby. Not every decision, but enough of them to change how they thought about power. England still claimed sovereignty. The king still stood above the colonies in law. But distance changes politics. An ocean is not just water. It is delay, improvisation, and habit-forming freedom. The people who came here were not only fleeing old constraints, many were also trying to build something new. Different colonies became different kinds of experiments. And experiment requires local judgment. That is where self-government becomes real. Not when philosophers describe the ideal republic, but when neighbors must coordinate roads, fields, defense, taxes, contracts, and disputes, because no distant authority can manage daily life fast enough. Start with New England. Its town meetings are the clearest example. Men gathered locally, argued openly, voted publicly, and then lived with the results. That mattered because the same people paying the tax, clearing the road, or standing militia watch were often the people deciding what had to be done. Power was closer. That made it more immediate and more accountable. Closer power is not always gentler power, but it is harder to ignore. You know who made the decision, and tomorrow you will probably see him again. The local courts mattered just as much. For many colonists, the magistrate nearby had far more effect on daily life than the king across the ocean ever did. That is easy to miss today. Modern people often imagine politics flowing downward from the top. But in colonial America, the nearest court, nearest assembly, nearest church committee, nearest militia captain often mattered more than distant imperial grandeur. This did not mean the colonies were democratic in the modern sense. Political participation was still limited. Self-government was real and incomplete. But for those inside it, the habit mattered deeply. The colonies were learning self-rule before they ever claimed independence. Still, the habit mattered. People who are used to gathering, arguing, petitioning, voting, and settling practical problems nearby begin to think differently about authority itself. You start asking different questions. Why should a distant minister, governor, company, or parliament understand my life better than I do? Why should men who do not share my risks make all the rules? That instinct was not born in one colony alone. Virginia had county courts, vestries, and local justices. Pennsylvania had assemblies, county institutions, and practical local bargaining. The Dutch world had town courts and merchant civic habits. The frontier had councils, captains, and necessity. Different colonies handled power differently, but many of them shared one reality. England was too far away to govern everything closely, quickly, and intelligently. Distance forced improvisation, and improvisation created habit. Over time, habit became expectation. That expectation was political, but it was also cultural. People who routinely solve problems together at close range learned to trust local knowledge more than distant plans. This is one reason self-government mattered so much. It taught responsibility before it taught rights. It taught participation before independence. And it taught ordinary people that order could be built from below. But here again, the story should not be romanticized. Local self-rule could become petty, exclusionary, factional, and unfair. Neighbors are not always wise simply because they are nearby. Majorities could be harsh. Local power could be captured by families, factions, churches, or influential men. A closer ruler is still a ruler. This is why self-government alone is not enough. It still needs structure, it still needs restraint, it still needs virtue. Participation does not automatically produce justice. But despite its flaws, the practice mattered enormously. The colonies were filling with people who had learned to deliberate, compromise, vote, petition, and enforce local decisions. That is not a small thing. It is political training. By the time imperial conflict sharpened, many colonists were already used to seeing government from the inside, not as a distant spectacle, as a task. That is a very different political culture from one built entirely on passive obedience. And it helps explain why colonial grievances cut so deeply once Britain began pressing harder from above. People who have never governed themselves may submit more easily to distant command. People who already manage their own communities start asking why outside power should override them at all. So before there was a declaration, there was practice. Before there was independence, there was local habit. Before there was a republic, there were many small republic-like worlds training people for responsibility. And that habit shaped more than politics. It shaped character. People who vote, judge, argue, and compromise nearby begin to feel that public life belongs partly to them. That feeling can become pride. It can become stubbornness. It can become wisdom. And sometimes all three at once. This is also why local government once felt far more important than it often does now. For many colonists, the nearest court, assembly, and town meeting shaped daily life more directly than any distant sovereign ever could. That contrast matters. Because when politics becomes only national spectacle, people forget what self-government actually requires. Not just opinions, responsibility nearby. The colonies did not become independent merely because philosophers wrote well. They became independent partly because ordinary people had already learned, unevenly, imperfectly, how to govern pieces of their own world. That solved something real. It built trust in local knowledge, skill in participation, and confidence that order need not always descend from above. But it also created a weakness. A people trained to trust local judgment can become suspicious of larger institutions, even when those institutions are necessary. The habit of self-rule can resist overreach and also resist coordination. That trade-off will matter later. For now, what matters is this. Americans were not suddenly handed self-government in 1776. They had been rehearsing it for generations. And that leaves the deeper question. Can liberty survive in a people who stop practicing responsibility nearby? Can self-government endure if it becomes only a slogan and no longer a habit? For the fight for liberty never ends. It only changes hands.
Part 5. Revolution, Declaration, and Contradiction. By the time Britain became the common enemy, the colonies had already become different peoples with a shared problem.
By the 1770s, the colonies faced the same empire. The same taxes, the same regulations, the same growing sense that Britain no longer understood colonial life. The Stamp Act, the Townshend Duties, the Tea Act, the Coercive Acts. Pressure kept building. But the colonies did not face that pressure as one people. They were still rival worlds. Different regions, different instincts, different ideas about liberty. The revolution did not begin with one America finally finding its voice. It began when several different Americas started deciding, for different reasons, that Britain had become the greater threat. By now, the old factions were still there. New England still carried moral order. The Southern elites still carried hierarchy. Pennsylvania still carried conscience. New York still carried trade. And the frontier still carried autonomy. The imperial crisis was shared. The interpretation was not. Each faction heard Britain through the instincts it already had. In New England, the crisis sounded moral before it sounded strategic. These were people already trained to think in terms of corruption, duty, and public order. They did not just hear taxes. They heard betrayal. They heard corruption in power. They heard self-government under threat. That is why New England could mobilize so quickly. Its people were already used to assemblies, sermons, pamphlets, and organized public argument. For them, the imperial crisis did not feel like a technical dispute. It felt like a public moral cause. New England was primed to turn pressure into protest. Its inherited instincts made resistance feel not only lawful, but righteous. In the South, the crisis sounded different. The Cavaliers and their heirs did not hear it first as a covenant crisis. They heard it as intrusion, outside interference in local rule, threats to property, pressure from a distant authority reaching into a world that believed it should govern itself. These men believed in rights, they believed in land, they believed in local control, and they deeply resented distant intrusion into all three. Their resistance was not quite the same as New England's. Less communal sermon, more defense of established rights, property, and regional authority. But they, too, were being pushed toward rupture. Because a people who rule locally do not easily accept being ruled from far away. Then there were the Quakers. And here the crisis becomes more complicated. Because Pennsylvania carried one of the strangest inheritances in colonial America. The Quakers could see coercion clearly. They could recognize injustice and imperial overreach. They understood what it meant when power stopped listening to conscience. But they were also a people built around restraint, agreement, peace, a deep unease with violence. That made the imperial crisis hard for them to hear cleanly. Britain's coercion was real, but so was their reluctance to answer coercion with war. This is one reason the Quakers matter so much on the eve of revolution. They remind us that opposition to imperial power did not automatically produce enthusiasm for revolutionary violence. A conscience-based people were living through escalation. And escalation is hard on people who believe moral truth should restrain power from every side. They could not ignore the crisis, but they could not join it easily either. That is a different kind of pressure than the one New England felt. So the imperial crisis forced a question onto the Quakers that their whole world had tried to postpone. What does conscience do when conflict comes anyway? That is why Pennsylvania did not hear the road to revolution as a simple march toward freedom. It heard it as a moral trial. In New York and the Dutch-descended commercial world, the crisis also sounded different. Less like covenant, less like frontier grievance, more like interference. This was an urban, plural, commercial society. It had long been used to bargaining, administration, trade, and the practical management of difference. So when Britain tightened control, New York did not hear only abstract tyranny. It heard commercial restriction, administrative pressure, outside interference in civic and economic life. That mattered in a place built around exchange, because trade was not just wealth, it was how the city functioned, how difference remained livable, how civic life held together. This made the Dutch commercial reading of the crisis more sophisticated than people often realize. They were not simply asking whether Britain was just, they were also asking whether Britain still understood how this kind of society worked. A plural city hears power differently. A commercial city does too. It becomes sensitive to regulation, disruption, and distant administration in ways the other factions do not. So New York's crisis was not only political, it was civic, commercial, institutional, a threat to the autonomy of a society built around trade and practical coexistence. That is one reason this faction matters. It shows that the road to revolution also passed through cities, ports, restrictions, contracts, and the daily management of a society that was already larger and more mixed than the old village worlds. On the frontier, the Scots-Irish heard the crisis through instincts they already had. They did not need to be taught to distrust distant power. They had been conditioned by it. To them, distant authority already meant something dangerous. People making decisions from safer places. Power without shared risk. Rule without real understanding. So the imperial crisis confirmed more than it revealed. It told the frontier that its old suspicions were right. Representation mattered differently when you lived on the edge. Neglect felt different there. And authority imposed from far away always felt weaker, slower, and less legitimate. So by the early 1770s, the old factions were still standing. Still different, still hearing the same empire through very different ears. New England heard moral betrayal. The South heard intrusion into rights, land, and local control. The Quakers heard coercion without an easy moral answer. New York heard pressure on trade and civic autonomy. The frontier heard old suspicions confirmed. They were not becoming the same. But Britain was becoming the larger problem. That is the real turning point. The revolution did not begin with unity of culture. It began with overlap of grievance. Different motives, different fears, different inherited worlds. one gathering confrontation. And that meant the declaration to come would not fall on blank ground. It would land in minds already shaped by rival civilizations. The same words would soon travel through New England, Virginia, Pennsylvania, New York, and the backcountry. But they would not mean exactly the same thing in each place, because the imperial crisis was forcing the colonies together, but it was not making them the same. And that is what the next chapter must explain. How one declaration spoke to 5 different Americas at once.
The eve of revolution did not erase the differences. It forced them into the same crisis.
July 1776 was not just another protest season. Something larger was taking shape. The colonies were preparing to speak in a new voice. For years, the colonies had argued with Britain. Now they were preparing to justify a final break. That matters, because the Declaration was not written as reckless rebellion. It was written as a grave public argument. It did not claim that all authority was evil. It claimed that authority had limits, and that British rule had crossed them. The Declaration spoke of equality. It spoke of rights. It spoke of government by consent. It spoke of a people who may alter or abolish rule that becomes destructive of those ends. And then it did something more. It turned theory into accusation, a long train of abuses, a bill of injuries, a case for separation. But the Declaration did not land on blank ground. It landed in minds already shaped by rival colonial worlds. That is why the same words did not mean exactly the same thing everywhere. The document was shared, the hearing was not. In New England, the Declaration sounded like moral principle made public. These were people already trained to hear politics in the language of duty, corruption, and righteous resistance. When the Declaration spoke of rights, New England heard more than private claims. It heard public obligation, a people defending rightful self-government against corrupt power. When it spoke of equality, New England heard moral seriousness. When it spoke of consent, New England heard covenant turned political. And when it listed abuses, New England heard proof. The theory had become evidence. The grievance had become a public case. That is why the Declaration fit New England so naturally. It sounded like principle, accusation, and duty all at once. In the South, the hearing was different. The Cavaliers and their heirs did not live in the same civic world as New England, but they recognized the language of violated rights immediately. When the Declaration spoke of rights, they heard property, land, honor, local control, a distant power crossing into a world it had no right to command so closely. When it spoke of government by consent, they heard the defense of a ruling world that believed local authority should remain local. The Declaration did not erase hierarchy there, but it gave hierarchy's defenders a language for saying that even established authority has limits when power becomes remote and unjust. Then there were the Quakers, and here the Declaration becomes more morally complicated. The Quakers could recognize coercion. They could recognize grievance. They could recognize injustice in power that no longer respected conscience or restraint. So when the Declaration spoke of injury, they heard something true. When it spoke of rights, they heard a moral claim they could not dismiss easily. But the Quakers also heard something harder. This was not merely a statement of rights, it was the prelude to war. That is what makes their hearing so important. They could hear the justice of the claim without finding peace in the path that followed from it. When the Declaration spoke of alter or abolish, New England heard duty. The frontier might hear defiance, but Quakers heard the terrible burden of what such a sentence would require. That does not make the Quaker hearing weaker. It makes it deeper. They remind us that just claims do not erase moral cost. So the Declaration reached Pennsylvania not as a simple call to celebration. It arrived as a moral reckoning. In the Dutch commercial world, the hearing shifted again. Less sermon, less hierarchy, more civic and commercial liberty. This was a plural city, a practical city, a city used to exchange, administration, bargaining, and self-direction. So when the Declaration spoke of rights, New York heard not only natural justice, it also heard civic autonomy, the right of a society to direct its own affairs without suffocating outside interference. When it spoke of abuses, the Dutch-descended world heard pressure on commerce, institutions, and the practical life of a city that had long learned how to make difference livable. The Declaration gave that world a rights language broad enough to include contracts, trade, civic order, and local self-direction without reducing everything to profit alone. That matters because New York did not hear the document as a village heard it. It heard it as a city. On the frontier, the declaration sounded different again. The Scots-Irish had long been conditioned to distrust distant rule. So when the declaration spoke of rights, they heard confirmation. When it spoke of unjust power, they heard recognition. When it spoke of legitimacy broken, they heard the truth of an old suspicion. These were people already used to power-making decisions from safer places, already used to distance, neglect, and rule without shared risk. So the declaration did not have to persuade them that distant power could become unjust. It told them that their instinct had been right. When it spoke of the right to alter or abolish, the frontier heard one of the hardest lines in the document with unusual clarity. Government exists to secure rights. When it no longer does, its claim weakens. That is why the frontier hearing mattered so much. The declaration gave moral and political form to instincts the borderlands had already been living. And so one document began to travel. Through New England towns, through Virginia estates, through Pennsylvania streets, through New York docks, through the backcountry. The words were the same, but the hearing was not. New England heard moral duty and violated self-government. The South heard rights, land, and local control. The Quakers heard conscience under the burden of conflict. New York heard civic and commercial liberty. The frontier heard distant power finally named as unjust. That is why the Declaration mattered so profoundly. It did not make the colonies the same. It gave them a common vocabulary, a common language of rights, a common language of grievance, a common language of legitimacy, a common language of separation. That was enough to justify joint action, but it was not enough to erase the rival inheritances beneath it. The Declaration did not create one culture. It gave rival cultures their first shared political voice. That is why this document still towers over the American story. Not only because it announced independence, but because it taught rival Americas how to speak together before they had fully learned how to live together. The Declaration was the first common language of rival Americas, and that is why it could speak to 5 different Americas at once.
The Declaration gave rival colonies a common language, but the words did not sound the same in every American ear.
This should not have worked. These colonies were not one culture. They were rival worlds. Different religions, different classes, different regional instincts, different definitions of liberty. And yet, out of those divisions, something larger began to form. Not a tribe, not a dynasty, not a throne. A political experiment, a new way of organizing power, a new way of organizing freedom. To understand why that experiment became possible, we have to step back, far back. For most of human history, political order rested on blood, conquest, tribe, throne, and inherited rank. Power belonged to dynasties or emperors or kings or warlords. People lived under rulers they did not choose, inside systems they did not design, by laws they did not help shape. That did not mean history stood still. Humanity learned, argued, built, failed, remembered. From Aristotle forward, thinkers had wrestled with justice, virtue, corruption, law, and the nature of good government. Christian moral thought added dignity, conscience, moral obligation, and judgment over rulers as well as subjects. English constitutional struggles added another inheritance: rights, limits on power, law above rulers. Then came the printing press. Ideas no longer had to move only at the speed of memory. Pamphlets could travel, arguments could spread, critique could survive. Sea travel shrank distances, empires stretched farther, ports became classrooms, the world became smaller and more comparable. So by the 18th century, humanity had reached an inflection point. Long human learning was no longer buried in books alone. It was becoming politically actionable. But America did not receive those ideas on blank ground either. The colonies had already been running experiments of their own. The Puritans had tested moral seriousness, covenant, literacy, institutional discipline, self-government inside a shared moral order. They revealed real strengths and real limits, moral ambition, and moral overreach. The Cavaliers had tested hierarchy, honor, landed independence, regional authority, liberty secured by rank and property. They revealed strengths too: stability, local rule, pride and independence, and the limits of liberty for the few. The Quakers had tested conscience, restraint, pluralism, negotiated coexistence, peaceable civic life. They showed that deep difference could sometimes be lived with, and they showed how fragile that achievement could be. The Dutch merchants had tested commerce, urban cooperation, practical tolerance, civic pragmatism. Difference made livable through exchange. They proved that trade could build real order, and they revealed the limits of prosperity without deeper cohesion. The Scots-Irish had tested autonomy, local loyalty, vigilance, resistance to distant power, toughness where institutions were weak. They revealed courage, self-reliance, and the dangers of grievance without enough restraint. No one faction had the whole answer. That is one of the deepest truths in the American story. What made the breakthrough possible was not that one faction finally defeated the others. It was that each had already learned something real, and each had already revealed something dangerous. The experiment grew out of lived experience, not abstract theory alone. Each carried truths, each carried failures, each carried inheritances that still live in America now. And that is why the breakthrough became possible. They were not starting from zero, they were starting from experience. They had seen what moral order could do, what hierarchy could do, what conscience could do, what trade could do, and what autonomy could do. And they had seen what each one could not do by itself. That matters because synthesis rarely begins in innocence. It begins when people learn that their own tribe is not enough. The breakthrough was not that difference disappeared. The breakthrough was that something higher began to discipline it. Rights, consent, legitimacy, representation, law above rulers. Natural rights mattered because they located justice beyond tribe, beyond dynasty, beyond bloodline, beyond inherited rank, above local tribe. For the first time at scale, political legitimacy was being anchored in something higher than power itself. We hold these truths to be self-evident was not just a line. It was a relocation of political legitimacy. Power would no longer justify itself merely by inheritance, or conquest, or throne, or coercion. It would now have to answer to justice. This was a leap in human cooperation too, perhaps one of history's greatest. Human beings are unique not only because they think, they are unique because they can cooperate at scale around shared abstractions. Law, trust, institutions, rights, common purpose. Not perfect democracy, not perfect equality, not final justice, but something genuinely new. A society consciously trying to anchor itself in liberty, at scale, under law, with structure. That was the break. From throne and tribe toward voluntary political union. British pressure still mattered. Of course it did. But pressure alone cannot explain the leap. Plenty of peoples have hated an empire. Far fewer have become capable of building something higher in response. What made the coalition possible was not fear alone. It was shared inheritance, shared learning, shared pressure, and shared imagination. They had enough experience of self-government to imagine cooperation, enough fear of domination to want restraints on power, enough intelligence to know their own systems were incomplete, and enough ambition to believe that a larger framework might secure more than any one faction could defend alone. But this experiment was never just freedom without form. They were not naive. They knew power corrupts. They knew tribes dominate. They knew liberty without structure can collapse into instability. So even in breakthrough, they were already thinking in terms of friction, restraint, compromise, the distributed power. The Constitution would come later as a more complete structural answer. But the mental breakthrough began here. So what was the great American experiment? It was not one tribe winning. It was not one culture becoming destiny. It was not one faction proving itself right. It was rival colonial worlds choosing to bind themselves to a common political future, without first becoming one people. That was the leap. That was the inflection point. That was the beginning of something the world had rarely seen at any scale. No one faction had the whole answer. Together, they built something larger than any one of them could secure alone. The inheritance was imperfect. The work was unfinished. The fears were real. The compromises were costly. But the breakthrough was still real. The Great American Experiment began when rival peoples discovered that they could build one future together without first becoming one people. That is why this still matters. America is not held together by blood, or tribe, or one inherited culture. It is held together by a common political faith, a belief that freedom must be protected by law, that power must answer to justice, and that very different people can still bind themselves to one shared future.
The American experiment was great because it reached for liberty at scale. It was troubled because it carried old wounds into a new promise.
Slavery was not the exception in human history. Freedom was. That is the part modern people often miss. Before America could wrestle with slavery, it had to emerge from an older world where freedom, as we understand it, barely existed for most people. Most people did not choose their rulers. They did not design their laws. They did not possess equal rights before political power. They lived under kings, empires, lords, local masters, inherited rank. For thousands of years, slavery existed across civilizations, races, religions, and empires. It was not American in origin. It was not uniquely Western. It was one of humanity's oldest institutions. That does not make slavery less evil. It makes the rise of liberty more extraordinary. The colonies were not born from a free world. They were born from a world of hierarchy and dependence. Europe itself had only recently begun moving beyond older systems of feudal obligation, noble privilege, and land-bound labor. Serfs were not chattel slaves, but they were not free in the modern sense either. Many were bound to land, bound to lord, bound to custom, bound to inherited obligation. So the deeper question was not simply why slavery existed in colonial America. The deeper question was how liberty could grow out of a world where unfreedom had been normal, and colonial America inherited many forms of unfreedom. Indentured servants crossed the Atlantic bound by contracts they could not simply walk away from. Some came voluntarily, trading years of labor for passage. Others came under harsher conditions. They were not slaves. Their servitude usually had an end, but they still lived for years under another person's command. Apprentices were bound, tenants were dependent, convicts were transported, households were ordered by authority. This was a world where dependence came in many forms, and into that world came African slavery. The Atlantic slave trade was vast, but even here, the numbers surprised people. Millions were carried across the Atlantic. Most did not go to what became the United States. About 4.8 million were transported to Brazil. About 4.7 million were sent to the Caribbean. At least 388,000 arrived in mainland North America. That does not minimize American slavery. It places it inside the larger Atlantic world. By the time of independence, the 13 colonies held about 2.5 million people. Roughly 500,000 were enslaved. So slavery was real. It was significant. And it was unevenly distributed. Some colonies were deeply shaped by it. Others were less dependent on it. But no region was untouched by the broader Atlantic system. And the early story was more complicated than many modern arguments allow. In 1655, Anthony Johnson, a free black landowner in Virginia, won a court dispute involving John Casor, whom Johnson claimed as bound for life. That one case did not create American slavery by itself, but it does show that early colonial labor was not the simple story people often imagine. Over time, that mixed world hardened. Indentured servitude declined in importance. African slavery expanded. Colonial law began turning status into something inherited, racial, and permanent. That was the hardening of racial chattel slavery, and it became one of the deepest contradictions in colonial life. Most colonists did not own slaves. Many were small farmers, laborers, tradesmen, servants, frontier families, merchants, or town dwellers. But slavery still shaped law, wealth, politics, labor, and regional power, far beyond the number of people who personally owned slaves. That is the balance this story requires. Do not pretend every colonist was a slave owner. Do not pretend slavery barely mattered. Both claims distort the past. The contradiction was most visible in the Cavalier South. There, liberty was tied to land, property, household authority, local rule, and independence from distant power. From the Great House, this looked like freedom. From below, it looked very different. The same world that taught elites to fear distant power also taught them to command everyone beneath them. That was not hypocrisy in the shallow sense. It was a social order built on unequal freedom. Liberty for the few was not just an idea, it was a structure. But this was not only a Southern problem. New England had slavery too. So did New York. So did the Middle Colonies. The scale differed, The dependence differed, the moral pressure differed. But the contradiction crossed geography. The Quakers became one of the places where that contradiction grew hardest to ignore. Not because they were perfect from the beginning, they were not. But a people who believed conscience could not be forced had planted a dangerous question. If conscience matters, what happens to bondage? If all people stand before God, what happens to inherited domination? The critique of slavery did not come from outside the liberty tradition, it grew from inside it. And then came the Declaration. It did not abolish slavery. It did not solve the contradiction overnight, but it changed the ground under the contradiction. We hold these truths to be self-evident, placed American legitimacy on a new foundation. Rights were not gifts from kings. Equality was not permission from Parliament. Consent was not a favor from empire. That language did not end slavery, but it made slavery answerable to a higher standard. The stronger the language of liberty became, the harder slavery became to defend without contradiction. That is why the Declaration created a beachhead. Not the whole victory, not the final battle, a beachhead. And no, they could not simply wave a wand and unwind the entire inherited order in the middle of crisis. They were breaking from the most powerful empire in their world. They were trying to hold rival colonies together. They were trying to survive war. They were trying to become a people. Some defended slavery, some profited from it, some feared what ending it would do to their world. Some already saw the evil more clearly. The failure to end slavery immediately was real, but so was the principle that would eventually be used against it. The Constitution would later become a bundle of compromises. In this series, we have called it a peace treaty among rival American worlds. And like many peace treaties, it contained problems it could not yet solve. But the Declaration had already done something history-changing. It made liberty the standard. It made equality part of American legitimacy. It made consent the test of rightful government. And once those principles were spoken, slavery could never again hide completely behind custom, property, or inherited power. This is the Freedom Contradiction. America inherited slavery from a world where unfreedom was normal. But America also declared principles that made unfreedom impossible to defend forever. That does not erase the contradiction. It explains why the contradiction could not stay buried. The Declaration did not win the war against slavery overnight, but it established the ground from which that war would eventually be fought. Slavery was ancient, liberty was the revolution. And that is why the American story cannot be reduced to guilt or denial. It is the story of a people born inside contradiction, carrying principles powerful enough to challenge the world they inherited. For the fight for liberty never ends. It only changes hands.
Part 6. Victory, Failure, and the Peace Treaty. Winning independence solved the British problem. It did not solve the American problem.
America won the Revolution, then almost lost itself. The Revolution solved the empire problem. It did not solve the American problem. The colonies had beaten Britain, but beating Britain did not automatically create one strong country. That is the part people often skip. Winning independence was not the ending. It was the next test. During the war, unity had a clear target. Britain was the enemy. That made the argument simpler. But once Britain was gone, the old questions came back. Who gets the power? Who makes the rules? The states? The national government? Local communities? Courts? Creditors? Farmers? Independence had not answered that. America was free from Britain, but not yet bound to itself. Under the Articles of Confederation, America had a national government, but it was intentionally weak. That made sense at first. These people had just fought a king. They were not eager to build another powerful center. That fear was not irrational. A strong central government had just meant royal governors, distant laws, taxes, troops, and orders from across the ocean. So the first instinct was understandable. Keep power close. Keep authority local. Do not build another throne. But a government designed mostly to avoid becoming dangerous had another problem. It struggled to become useful. That was the trap. They had escaped centralized power. Now they had to figure out how to build limited power. So they built a government with very little muscle. It could ask the states for money, but it could not really force them to pay. It could make promises, but it struggled to keep them. It could speak for the nation, but the nation barely acted like one. And this created a problem bigger than paperwork. The war was over, but the bills were just arriving. During war, people can delay the hard questions. They can borrow. They can promise. They can hope victory will make everything easier. But peace does not erase the cost of war. Peace sends the bill. The soldier came home. The farmer came home. The tax collector came too. That is when victory started to feel less like an ending and more like a test. Soldiers came home unpaid. Farmers came home to debt. States raised taxes to survive. Courts demanded payment, creditors wanted what they were owed, and ordinary people started to feel squeezed by the very system they had helped create. Some veterans began asking a dangerous question. Did we fight a revolution just to get crushed by our own government? That question exploded in Massachusetts, and it became known as Shays' Rebellion. Shays' Rebellion was not just a random riot, it was a warning flare. Veterans who had fought for liberty now felt trapped by debt, taxes, and courts, so they shut down courts to stop foreclosures. These were not cartoon rebels. Many were men who had risked their lives for the revolution. They had heard the language of liberty. Now they were watching courts take farms from men who had fought for it. That did not make rebellion safe, but it made the fear real. The revolution had taught Americans to resist power. Now they had to learn how to govern resistance. To them, this felt like survival. To others, it looked like the revolution was starting to eat itself. That was the scary part. Both sides could claim the language of liberty. One side feared tyranny from above, the other feared chaos from below. And suddenly, America had a problem Britain could not be blamed for. This was America arguing with itself. The old colonial worlds had not disappeared. They had simply moved into the same new country. New England still cared about moral order and local self-rule. Virginia still cared about land, rank, and local power. Pennsylvania still carried the weight of conscience and restraint. New York still thought in terms of trade, ports, money, and practical deals. The frontier still distrusted distant authority. Independence did not erase these differences. It put them inside one fragile experiment. And now the experiment was wobbling. Trade was messy. Money was unstable. States competed with each other. The national government could not reliably pay debts. It could not easily protect American interests abroad. And it could not make the states act like teammates. America had freedom from Britain, but it did not yet have structure at home. That is the lesson this generation had to learn. Liberty alone was not enough. Not because liberty was bad, because liberty without structure could collapse into debt, retaliation, disorder, and distrust. Local self-government was one of America's strengths. But localism alone could not hold a continent together. 13 states pulling 13 directions was not a country. It was a slow-motion breakup. Washington saw it. He had fought to win the revolution. Now he worried the victory could be wasted. Madison saw the design problem. Hamilton saw the financial weakness. Different men saw different symptoms. But the diagnosis was becoming harder to avoid. The system was too weak. Not because Americans needed a king. They had already rejected that. They needed something harder. A government strong enough to hold the Union together, but restrained enough not to become the thing they had just escaped. That was the real challenge. Build power, but limit it. Protect liberty, but prevent collapse. Honor local government, but create national survival. This was not a simple argument. It was the question every free society eventually faces. How do you create enough authority to hold together without creating so much authority that liberty dies? That question could not be solved by slogans. It had to be built into a system. By the mid-1780s, more Americans were realizing the first system was not enough. The Articles had helped them survive a war, but they were struggling to survive peace. That sounds backward, but peace can expose problems war hides. During war, fear can hold people together. After war, bills come due. Promises get tested. Trust runs thin. And rival interests stop pretending they agree. That was America after independence. Free from Britain, not yet bound to each other. So the next question was no longer whether Americans could break from empire. They had done that. The new question was whether rival American worlds could be bound into one constitutional order. Not erased, not flattened, bound. Because winning independence did not settle the argument, it revealed the argument. What is liberty without order? What is local freedom without national survival? What is a revolution worth if the country it creates cannot hold? America had won independence from Britain, but it had not yet learned how to survive itself. The next answer would not be another declaration. It would be a framework, a structure, a compromise, a way to hold rival worlds together. In this series, we have called it a peace treaty among rival American worlds. That peace treaty would be called the Constitution.
The Revolution had taught Americans how to resist power. The Constitution had to teach them how to live with power restrained.
America did not need the Constitution because everyone agreed. It needed the Constitution because they did not. The Constitution was not just a legal document, it was a peace treaty. A peace treaty among rival American worlds. The Revolution had broken America away from Britain, but independence had not answered the harder question. Could these different peoples actually govern together? The answer was not obvious. America had been born from rival cultures. New England carried moral order and local self-government. Virginia carried land, rank, leadership, and local power. Pennsylvania carried conscience, restraint, and the hope that people could live together without forcing belief. New York carried trade, contracts, ports, money, and practical cooperation. The frontier carried courage, autonomy, and deep suspicion of distant power. Those differences did not vanish when the war ended. They walked into independence together. Then they started pulling apart. The Articles of Confederation were too weak to hold them. The government could ask, it could plead, it could promise, but it could not reliably act. Debt piled up. States competed. Trade became messy. Trust wore thin. And in Massachusetts, angry farmers and veterans rose up. Shays' Rebellion was a warning. The Revolution had taught Americans how to resist power. Now they had to learn how to govern resistance. That was the real crisis. America did not need another king. It needed power strong enough to hold the Union together and weak enough to be controlled. That is not an easy thing to build. Madison saw the design problem. Hamilton saw the need for national strength. Washington saw the danger of wasting the Revolution. Franklin knew the answer would require compromise. But the real main character was the room. A room full of men who did not agree. Large states wanted one thing, small states wanted another. Northern states feared Southern power. Southern states feared Northern control. Some feared democracy would become mob rule. Others feared elites would lock ordinary people out. Everyone feared someone else's power. The room was not calm because the stakes were small. It was tense because everyone knew the stakes were enormous. This was not one argument. It was many arguments stacked together. Power against liberty, states against nation, order against local control. Any simple answer would have broken something important. So the Constitution had to become something harder than a slogan. It had to become a system. That fear could have destroyed the country. Instead, they built fear into structure. Federalism let power live in more than one place. The states would still matter. The nation would finally have muscle. That was one part of the peace treaty. Separation of powers divided authority. No single branch would hold everything. Checks and balances made power answer to power. Ambition would not disappear, so ambition had to be checked. Representation gave the people a voice, but it slowed power down. That delay was not a bug, it was part of the design. The amendment process admitted something important. The system would need correction. The founders were not pretending they had finished history. They were building a way to keep working. Federalism answered one fear. People wanted local control because local life was real. Their farms, churches, towns, courts, roads, and markets were close enough to touch. But a continent could not survive if every state acted like its own little country. Separation of powers answered another fear. What if one person, one branch, or one majority grabbed too much? The answer was not to pretend ambition would disappear. The answer was to make ambition run into other ambition. Representation gave the people a voice. Checks and balances gave power guardrails. The amendment process admitted the system would need correction. The Constitution turned distrust into design. And still, the Constitution did not solve everything. The slavery contradiction remained. The Constitution held the Union together, but it also carried wounds forward. That must be said honestly. A peace treaty does not mean every wound is healed. It means the fighting is contained long enough for the next work to begin. That was the genius and the burden of the Constitution. It did not erase disagreement. It gave disagreement a place to go. Courts, elections, legislatures, states, a national government. The Constitution was built to keep people at the table. But it cannot work if everyone wants to flip the table. That is the warning. The Constitution was built for argument. It was built for rivalry. It was built for people who do not see the world the same way. but it still requires something from them. Enough restraint to stay in the room. Enough humility to admit no side sees everything. Enough trust to keep the rules when the rules do not give you what you want. No one gets everything in a republic. That is not a flaw, that is the point. Common ground does not mean pretending differences are small. It means deciding the country is bigger than the fight. The Constitution can divide power, it can slow power, it can check power, but it cannot give people self-control. That warning is not trapped in the 1700s. Nearly everyone can feel that something has drifted. People disagree about what caused it. They disagree about who is to blame. But the deeper question is older than our moment. Can people who disagree still share a country? Can they listen long enough to understand what the other side fears? Can they find enough common ground to keep building? Common ground does not mean pretending differences are small. It means deciding the country is bigger than the fight. The Constitution can keep people at the table, but it cannot make them want to stay there. That part belongs to the people. A nation cannot govern itself if its people have stopped practicing self-government with each other. Self-government starts smaller than the national government. It starts with the person, the family, the neighborhood, the community. That is why the Constitution was more than ink and parchment. It was a bet on a people. Not perfect people. Not one people. A people different enough to argue but committed enough to stay bound. America did not become one nation by erasing its differences. It became one nation by building a system strong enough to hold disagreement. That was the peace treaty. That was the Constitution. And that was the final lesson of the American experiment. For the fight for liberty never ends. It only changes hands. The rebirth begins with you.
And so the story comes to its final turn. America did not become one nation by becoming one people first. It became one nation by building a system strong enough to hold disagreement. The Constitution did not end every argument. It gave argument a place to go. That was the peace treaty among rival American worlds. And that is why the American experiment remains unfinished. For the fight for liberty never ends. It only changes hands.